Dr. Marchangisi here with your Science Moment. Could it be that sociopolitical communities could go down a spiral where they become more irrational, and that makes them even more irrational, and so on? Now, most of us, we like to imagine that our own sociopolitical community is totally rational and justified all of the beliefs that we have, and the opposing community is totally irrational and or evil, and all the kinds of stereotypes that we talk about here. I try to always realize that my own sociopolitical leanings, wherever they may be, completely bias me, and that I'm definitely should treat those in the other communities having justifications. They may not be great justifications, but they truly believe them, and trying to usually presume, in the absence of any information or even a lot of information, that both sides are symmetrical in the kinds of biases that they're susceptible to. They both have, all sides, however many, but they, whichever side it is, ends up with the same kinds of narratives, and they select for membership signals which are arcane or irrational or at least arbitrary, and that these things, in the case of left-right, today's sort of left-right, that it might roughly symmetrically hit both sides. But of course, it need not actually be symmetrical at any given time. And when you start thinking through the fact that there was a socio-political community that believed that locking everybody down was justified, getting them all fired from their jobs was justified, deciding who could work and who couldn't was justified ethically, and actually made sense from a utilitarian perspective, that it was okay to shut down millions of businesses, that mask mandates were required, closing down schools was a good idea, right? Coerced medication, putting biological males into women's sports, transitioning minors to the opposite sex, right? Whenever it's hot outside, it justifies massive economic regulation and interventions in those regards. These are so glaringly irrational. The behavior of all of these things, these quick reactions, the mobs rushing through and having new kind of membership signals where they say, yes, we must do all these things. It justifies our ingenious schemes for this one and for another one and for another one and for another one, right? It just keeps happening. Now, you have to wonder whether there could be a tendency for these things to accelerate. So not only are there just potentially likely to be asymmetries just because of even if they're independent of one another, but once a community has a membership signal that is often irrational, and it becomes a kind of a virtue signal to sometimes a virtue position, a position that people state that is itself irrational, well, now within the narrative is a kind of falsity. It's either false or it's potentially even a contradiction. In logic, if you assume any contradiction, then all possible sentences, including all the false ones, follow. Everything follows, right? So you can't distinguish truth from fiction any longer once you've assumed or come to believe false things. So if a community comes to have as some key parts of of its very identity, things that are false, positions that are false, well, that potentially makes coming up with new false things even more likely. It's harder to find the truth. And that's a positive feedback loop, right? That just keeps going and going. There could potentially be breaks so that the entire thing doesn't, in fact, act like a positive feedback loop. Additionally, not only is it the case that you could have a positive feedback of sorts within a community that's engaged in too many irrationalities as part of their very positions within their narrative, but an opposing community might be a community because it's reacting to exactly those irrationalities on the other side, right? So could imagine there's going to be an interaction between these sorts of communities. The community that's engaged in overly many sort of irrationalities, well, the opposing community has been fighting those very irrationalities. Saying, look, that can't be true. And what they're going to get good at is good kinds of analytical tools and empirical tools to try to convince people why they're wrong. They're going to point out human biases. They're going to point out statistical significance. They're going to be much more careful and skeptical, and all the kinds of reasoning systems that are crucial for a good scientific thinker should become more central to that community. So not only do I think that there's a potentially huge asymmetries that could happen, and that becoming more irrational could lead the community to at least temporarily become more irrational, but I would suspect that it also leads to a concomitant reaction in the other community. Saying that, like, we've got to really get our analytical tools in order, and that becomes part of our narrative. Who we are, this community says to themselves, is about these kinds of analytical tools to fight the very irrationality that we have diagnosed in our opposition. So you have to wonder, although of course I think both sides are susceptible to these things, I'm not necessarily convinced at all that today's main political conversations are at all symmetrical. One side seems to be disproportionately steeped in completely irrational positions that characterize who they are. This is central to the very narratives that they hold, right? Now, certainly often on the right, there's lots of people with crazy ideas too, but very often it doesn't lead anywhere. They're not saying on the basis of my belief in Jesus Christ or whatever, that everybody needs to do this, right? That's not really a thing these days. Right? So there's definitely, and it's also not a virtue signal within the broader right community. It's a virtue position within some subsets of that, certainly, right? So I would love to be able to study the extent to which there's been asymmetries of these kinds at various times in the past and potentially other kinds of cultures. But I no longer believe that these things are potentially symmetric. And I think it's important, to the extent that you have your community and you realize that your community has virtue positions, which have to be somewhat weird, but they don't want to be false. They should at least be unusual, potentially things that characterize you as like, yeah, I think it's good to do this. Things that are not glaringly false, right? Start having virtue positions that are glaringly false. That only encourages more false beliefs and an inability to discover the truth for your very community. And that was your science moment. If you're interested in the kinds of dynamics that drive free expression, which is our emotional expressions, which undergirds all the communication that we do, even careful philosophers when they're discussing, it's steeped with emotional expression. They're not actually talking like Data from Star Trek or Spock. And even them, in most of their discussions, are steeping in emotional expressiveness because it's written by humans. Then get yourself a copy of Expressly Human.